When a physician vanishes without a trace, the questions left behind are often more troubling than the disappearance itself. But when that physician was last seen walking through rows of children's beds, checking small wrists for pulses that grew weaker by the day, and when the only witness to his final moments refuses to speak, the silence becomes deafening. What could a doctor discover in those examinations that would make someone ensure he never shared his findings? And why, decades later, would the mere mention of his name cause elderly survivors to close their doors and pull their curtains tight? In 1870, in the heart of Alabama's cotton country, a man arrived seeking truth. What he found would either be buried with him or buried by him. The difference between those two fates may be the most troubling mystery of all. Dr. Harlan Cross first read the letter on a Tuesday morning in late April 1870, sitting at his modest breakfast table in his Boston apartment. The envelope had traveled far. He could tell by the multiple postmarks, the wear on the edges, the slight water stain on one corner that spoke of rain somewhere along its journey from Montgomery, Alabama to Massachusetts. He recognized the handwriting immediately, though he hadn't seen it in nearly 15 years. Margaret Huxley. The name brought back memories of a different world, a different time. Summer evenings on her father's veranda in Mobile, discussions about poetry and philosophy, the innocent friendship between a young medical student and a merchant's educated daughter. That was 1855, before everything changed. Before the war that tore the country apart and left scars that still hadn't healed. Cross was 42 now, with grey threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many long nights and difficult cases. He'd served as a surgeon for the Union Army, seen horrors that still visited him in dreams, performed amputations in field tents while cannons thundered in the distance. After the war, he'd returned to Boston, established a small practice, and tried to rebuild something resembling a normal life. The letter in his hand suggested that normal life was about to be interrupted. He unfolded the paper carefully. Margaret's handwriting was more hurried than he remembered. The letters pressed hard into the page as if written with urgency. Dear Dr. Cross, I hope this letter finds you well, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption of my writing after so many years of silence. I would not reach out unless circumstances were desperate, but I find myself in a situation where I have nowhere else to turn. After the war, I came to Alabama to teach Alabama too. I believed I could make a difference in the Reconstruction efforts, help the newly freed people build lives for themselves. I've been working at Carver Plantation for the past 3 years, teaching the children of the workers there to read and write. Dr. Cross, something terrible is happening here, and no one will listen to me. The children are dying. It started 2 months ago. First it was little Mary, only 7 years old. She grew weak over the course of a week, complained of stomach pains, then died in her mother's arms. Dr. Vaughan from town said it was childhood fever. Then James died, age 9. Same symptoms, same diagnosis. Now 3 more have died and 5 others are showing the same signs. But here's what troubles me most. All the children who've fallen ill work in the same place, the processing shed where Mr. Carver has implemented what he calls revolutionary new methods for treating cotton seeds. I've tried to speak with him about it, but he dismisses my concerns. I went to Dr. Vaughan myself, but he insists there's no connection, that it's merely unfortunate coincidence. I don't believe in such coincidences, Harlan. Forgive the familiarity, but our old friendship emboldens me. These children are being killed by something, and I fear it's something in that shed. But I have no medical training, no authority, no way to prove what I suspect. I need someone who will look at this with a physician's eye, someone who isn't beholden to Mr. Carver's influence, someone I can trust. You're the only person I know who fits that description. I realize this is asking a great deal to travel so far to involve yourself in Southern affairs when I know your sympathies lay with the Union. But children are dying, and their skin color shouldn't determine whether anyone cares enough to investigate. Please, if there's any chance you can come, I'm begging you. Time is running out. Your old friend, Margaret Huxley. Cross read the letter 3 times, his breakfast growing cold beside him. He thought about his schedule. He had patients who depended on him, appointments already made. He thought about the difficulty of traveling to Alabama, about how unwelcome a northern doctor might be in the heart of the former Confederacy. He thought about the risks, but he also thought about children dying while adults argued about jurisdiction and influence. He thought about the Hippocratic oath he had sworn, and he thought about Margaret, who must be truly desperate to reach out after so many years. By noon, he'd made arrangements for another doctor to cover his patients. By evening, he'd packed his medical bag and a small trunk with clothes and supplies. By the next morning, he was on a train heading south, watching the spring landscape roll past his window, wondering what he was walking into. The journey took 4 days. The trains were slower now than before the war, the rails still being repaired in places, the stations showing signs of deterioration and neglect. Cross watched the landscape change as he traveled south, the greening hills of Virginia, the red clay of the Carolinas, finally the flat cotton fields of Alabama. When he changed trains in Atlanta, he noticed how people looked at him, his northern clothes, his bearing. Something about him marked him as foreign here. Conversations would quiet when he entered a railway car. Eyes would follow him with a mixture of suspicion and barely concealed hostility. The war might have ended 5 years ago, but here it still lived in people's hearts. Montgomery in May was like walking into a wall of heat and humidity. Cross stepped off the train into afternoon sunshine that felt thick enough to swim through. The station was smaller than he expected, with paint peeling from the walls and gaps in the platform boards. A few porters moved about, but the bustling commerce he remembered from before the war was absent. The city felt diminished, like something vital had been drained from it. He hired a buggy to take him to the boarding house Margaret had mentioned in her letter, a respectable establishment on the edge of town she'd written, where questions wouldn't be asked about a northern visitor. The driver, an elderly black man with white hair and weathered hands, accepted his money but said little during the ride. The boarding house was a 2-story wooden structure that had seen better days. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, was a thin woman with suspicious eyes who looked Cross over carefully before accepting his payment for a week's lodging. "You're that doctor Miss Huxley was expecting," she said. "It wasn't a question. I am. She was here yesterday, asked me to watch for you, left a note." Mrs. Patterson produced a sealed envelope from her apron pocket. Said, "You should read it before going out to the plantation." Cross took the envelope, thanked her, and climbed the narrow stairs to his room. It was small but clean. A bed, a washhand, a single chair, and a window that looked out onto the dusty street below. He opened the envelope. "Harron, thank God you've come. I've made arrangements for you to visit the plantation tomorrow. You'll be introduced as a colleague of mine, a teacher from Boston, interested in our educational methods. Mr. Carver mustn't know your true purpose. He's already irritated by my questions about the children, and if he knew I'd brought in a doctor specifically to investigate, he'd never allow you access. I'll meet you at the plantation at 10 tomorrow morning. We'll have to be extremely careful. I'll explain everything when I see you. Destroy this letter after reading." M. Cross held the paper over the lamp on the bedside table, watching it curl and blacken, Margaret's words disappearing into ash. He was already being drawn into deception, into a web of secrets and carefully intained lies. It made him uncomfortable, but he understood the necessity. If Carver Plantation was the source of what was killing the children, then Silas Carver himself might be complicit, whether through knowledge or negligence. Either way, a direct approach would only result in Cross being turned away. He spent the evening walking through Montgomery, getting a feel for the town. The grand buildings from before the war still stood, but many showed signs of neglect. Windows were broken and not repaired. Paint had faded and peeled. Gardens had grown wild. But there were also signs of life returning, shops reopening, people going about their business, children playing in the streets. He stopped at a small restaurant for dinner and overheard conversations at nearby tables, talk of cotton prices, of labor difficulties, of the hated Reconstruction government. One man complained loudly about uppity freed men who don't know their place, and Cross had to force himself to eat calmly, to not react, to remember he was here for a specific purpose and couldn't afford to draw attention to himself. After dinner, he found a small library still operating in what had been a church. The librarian, a young woman with kind eyes, helped him find back issues of the local newspaper. He spent 2 hours reading, learning about the area, about Carver Plantation and its owner. Silas Carver was 48, a widower who'd inherited his plantation from his father in 1859, just 2 years before the war began. He'd served briefly as a major in the Confederate Army, but had been discharged due to injury in 1862 and returned to manage his land. Unlike many plantation owners who'd been ruined by the war and the end of slavery, Carver had apparently adapted quickly to the new reality. He now employed his former slaves as tenant farmers and workers, paying them in scrip redeemable at the plantation store, a system that kept workers perpetually in debt and unable to leave. The newspaper portrayed him as a pillar of the community, an innovator who was helping the South rebuild. There was an article from 3 months ago about new agricultural methods he was implementing. Cross-read it carefully. Mr. Silas Carver of Carver Plantation has installed modern equipment for processing cotton seeds, utilizing advanced chemical treatments to prevent spoilage and pest infestation. This innovative approach has drawn interest from agricultural experts across the state and promises to revolutionize cotton production. Mr. Carver states that his new methods have increased his output by 40% while reducing losses to insects and decay. Chemical treatments, Cross's medical training immediately raised flags. He knew that many industrial processes use dangerous substances, arsenic compounds, lead solutions, mercury preparations. If improperly handled, if workers were exposed without protection or understanding of the risks, such treatments could be deadly. He left the library as it closed at 8 and walked back to the boarding house through streets growing dark. Oil lamps were being lit in windows. Somewhere in the distance he heard singing, spirituals, the haunting melodies that had come from slave churches and persisted in the freed men's communities. The sound was beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. That night, Cross lay awake in his narrow bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the South. RN night. Crickets and night birds, the occasional bark of a dog, footsteps on the wooden sidewalk below. He thought about the children dying slow deaths while their parents watched helplessly. He thought about Margaret alone in her determination to help them, and he thought about what he might find tomorrow when he finally saw Carver Plantation for himself. Cross rose before dawn and ate a simple breakfast of grits and ham that Mrs. Patterson served without conversation. He dressed carefully in his most conservative clothes, dark trousers, white shirt, simple vest, nothing that would mark him as pretentious or overly northern. He packed his medical bag carefully, hiding his stethoscope and other instruments beneath books and papers that would support his cover as a teacher. He'd arranged to rent a horse from the livery stable, and by 8 he was riding out of Montgomery on the road Margaret had described. The morning was already warm, promising another sweltering day. The road wound through countryside that must have been beautiful before the war. Rolling hills, stands of pine and oak, fields that had once been productive. Now many of the fields lay or were only partially cultivated. He passed several abandoned houses, their windows empty like blind eyes, their porches sagging. He also passed workers in the fields, men, women and children working with hoes and shovels, beginning their day's labor. They looked up as he rode by, faces carefully neutral, showing nothing of what they might think about a well-dressed white man riding past while they worked. Carver Plantation announced itself from a distance. Unlike many of the properties he'd passed, this one showed no sign of neglect. The fences were maintained, the fields were fully cultivated, and as he crested a hill, he saw the main house rising in the distance, a grand white structure with tall columns surrounded by oak trees. It looked almost exactly as it must have before the war, preserved like a monument to the old order. But as Cross rode closer, he began to see beyond the impressive facade. Behind the main house, spreading across the landscape, were the workers' quarters. Dozens of small cabins arranged in rows, basic structures that looked barely weatherproof. Beyond those were various outbuildings, barns, storage sheds, and what must be the processing shed Margaret had mentioned, a long, low building with a brick chimney rising from one end. Margaret was waiting for him at the split in the road that led either to the main house or to the workers' area. She stood beside a small cart, dressed in a simple grey dress, her face shaded by a broad-brimmed hat. When she saw him, she raised a hand in greeting, Cross dismounted, and approached her. She was thinner than he remembered, with fine lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before. But her eyes were the same, intelligent and determined. "Harlan," she said softly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came. Your letter was quite persuasive," Cross replied. "Tell me everything, but tell me quickly before we're in anyone's sight." Margaret's words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for too long. 3 children died in April: Mary, James, and little Daniel. 2 more died last week. Sarah and Thomas's sister Anna. 5 more are sick now with the same symptoms: weakness, stomach pain, vomiting, and this strange discoloration of the skin. The local doctor insists it's just various childhood ailments. But Harlan, I've seen enough to know it's all the same thing, and every single one of them works in the processing shed. What exactly do they do in that shed? They process cotton seeds, sorting, treating, packaging them for sale. Mr. Carver says he's using a new chemical solution that makes the seeds resistant to insects and mold. He's very secretive about the exact process, calls it a proprietary method. But whatever it is, I think it's poisoning the children. Have you been inside? Once briefly, when I first arrived at the plantation, I remember the smell, chemical, harsh. It made my eyes water. Mr. Carver gave me a quick tour, showed me how efficiently the children worked, then ushered me out. I haven't been allowed back since. He says it's for safety reasons, that the chemicals might damage women's constitutions. Her voice carried bitter irony. Cross nodded, filing away the information. And Mr. Carver himself, what kind of man is he? Intelligent, calculating. He presents himself as a progressive employer, better than most in the area. He pays wages, though they're paid in script, only good at his store, which charges inflated prices. He allows me to teach the children, which many planters don't. He speaks about the importance of helping the freedmen adjust to their new lives. She paused, but underneath the pleasant words, there's iron. He expects absolute obedience. Workers who complain too much find themselves dismissed, which means evicted from their homes with no references, no way to find work elsewhere. Everyone here is afraid of him. And what will he think of me? I've told him you're a colleague from Boston, interested in our educational efforts in the South. He was pleased by that, likes the idea of Northern approval of his methods. You'll need to flatter him, I'm afraid. Let him show off his operation. He has considerable pride. Cross remounted his horse, and Margaret climbed back onto her cart. Together they continued toward the plantation. But now they rode in silence, playing their roles as simple teacher and visiting colleague. As they approached the main house, a man emerged onto the front porch. Even from a distance, Cross could feel the force of his presence. Silas Carver was tall and broad-shouldered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. He wore well-tailored clothes despite the heat, and his beard was perfectly trimmed. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching their approach with eyes that seemed to take in every detail. "Miss Huxley," Carver called out as they drew near. His voice was deep and cultured, with the distinctive accent of the educated South. "And this must be our visitor from Boston." Cross dismounted and approached the porch, extending his hand. "Dr. Harlan Cross, sir, though I'm here in my capacity as an educator rather than a physician, Miss Huxley has told me impressive things about your operation here." Carver's handshake was firm, his eyes sharp as they studied Cross, a doctor turned teacher. An interesting transformation. "The war changes us all, Mr. Carver. I found I had a calling to help rebuild through education rather than continuing in medical practice. The lie came more easily than Cross expected. Miss Huxley's letters about her work here inspired me to see for myself how the South is approaching the education of the freed men. You'll find we are quite progressive here," Carver said with obvious pride. "Unlike some planters who resist the new order, I've embraced it. I pay wages. I allow education. I'm implementing modern methods that will make this plantation profitable in a way that benefits everyone." He gestured broadly. Come, let me show you what we've built here. The next hour was a carefully choreographed tour. Carver walked them through the grounds, pointing out improvements he'd made, workers he'd helped find employment, fields that were producing better than before the war. Cross played his part, asking interested questions, taking notes in a small book as if documenting educational approaches. But his eyes were those of a physician trained to observe. He watched the workers they passed, noted the thinness of many, the worn-out clothes, the weariness in their eyes. When Carver approached, he saw children who should have been in school working in the fields instead. He noticed that while Carver spoke about fair wages, there was no actual money changing hands, only tallies marked in a ledger book. Finally, inevitably, they approached the processing shed. "This is the heart of my operation," Carver announced with unmistakable pride. "My innovation that's putting Carver Plantation at the forefront of modern agriculture." The shed was larger up close than it had appeared from a distance. The walls were solid wood, darkened by weather and time. There were a few small windows set high in the walls, and Cross noted immediately that they were all closed despite the heat. The door was heavy-wit. A substantial lock. "I employ mostly children here," Carver explained. "Not because I wish to exploit youth, you understand, but because the work requires small, nimble fingers, and the wages they earn help support their families." He produced a key and unlocked the door. "The chemicals we use are quite valuable, so security is necessary." Cross's heart beat faster as the door swung open. This was it. This was where the children were dying. The smell hit him first, even before his eyes adjusted to the dimmer interior. His nose caught the sharp chemical odor that Margaret had described. It was familiar, troublingly familiar. He'd smelled variations of it in military facilities, in factories, in places where dangerous substances were used. Inside, the shed was dim despite the mid-morning sun. The few windows provided minimal light, and oil lamps burned at intervals along the walls. The air was thick and close, heavy with heat and chemical vapor. Along one wall stood large metal tanks, their surfaces dark and pitted. Along the other were long tables where children sat working. Cross counted quickly, 14 children, ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 13. They were sorting cotton seeds, placing them in baskets, then transferring the baskets to the tanks. Other children were pulling dried seeds from different containers and packaging them in cloth sacks. Their movements were methodical, practiced, but Cross noticed immediately that several of them moved sluggishly as if exhausted. "The process is straightforward," Carver explained, leading them between the tables. "The seeds are sorted for quality, then immersed in my treatment solution for precisely 3 hours. After draining, they re-dried on these racks, then packaged for sale. The chemical treatment prevents insect infestation and fungal growth, meaning farmers can store seeds for months without loss." "What exactly is the treatment solution?" Cross asked, keeping his tone casual, merely interested. "A proprietary mixture," Carver replied smoothly. "Trade secret, you understand, but I can tell you it's completely safe. Approved by the State Agriculture Bureau." Cross moved closer to one of the tanks. The metal was corroded in places, a green-gray patina that made his stomach tighten. He recognized that kind of corrosion. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the tank. "Of course, but don't get too close. The vapors can be quite harsh." Cross leaned over the tank carefully. The liquid inside was dark with an oily sheen on the surface. The smell was stronger here, acrid, metallic, and now he was almost certain. The color, the odor, the type of corrosion, these were all consistent with arsenitate solutions, probably copper arsenate or lead arsenate, highly toxic, especially with prolonged exposure. He looked at the children working nearby. They wore no protective gear, no gloves or masks. Their hands were stained dark from the chemicals. When they wiped sweat from their faces, they were transferring those chemicals to their skin. With every breath in this enclosed space, they were inhaling toxic vapors. "How many hours do the children work here each day?" Cross asked. 6 hours with a brief break for a meal. Quite reasonable, I think. 6 hours a day breathing toxic air, handling poisonous substances in an enclosed space with poor ventilation for children whose smaller bodies would be more susceptible to the effect. T.'s Cross felt rage building in his chest, but forced his expression to remain neutral, interested, academic, and, have there been any health issues? I understand some children have been ill recently. Carver's expression flickered. Just for a moment, something cold passed behind his eyes. Childhood ailments unfortunately common. Dr. Vaughan attributes it to various fevers, tragic but unrelated to their work here. The Chamber of Commerce has investigated and found no concerns. It was a smooth lie delivered with complete confidence. Cross glanced at Margaret and saw the tightness around her mouth. The anger she was also suppressing. I see, Cross said. Well, it's certainly an impressive operation. The efficiency is remarkable. They left the shed a few minutes later, stepping back into the sunshine. Cross breathed deeply, grateful for fresh air, but his mind was already cataloguing everything he'd seen. The symptoms Margaret described matched arsenet poisoning perfectly. The children's exposure was constant and unprotected, and Silas Carver either knew exactly what he was doing and didn't care, or was willfully ignorant of the consequences of his innovative methods. Either way, Cross thought grimly, children were dying and something had to be done. After the tour, Margaret invited Cross to see her classroom, a small building near the workers' quarters that served as the Plantation school. Carver excused himself to attend to business matters, clearly satisfied that he'd impressed his northern visitor. As soon as they were alone in the classroom, Margaret closed the door and turned to Cross with desperate eyes. Well, did you see what I meant? Cross set his bag on one of his small desks and pulled out his notebook. I need to examine the sick children immediately. The situation is worse than your letter suggested, Margaret. Those children are being poisoned. You're certain? Nearly certain. The chemical solution Carver is using appears to be some form of arsenet, likely copper or lead arsenetate. It's used in industrial applications, and I've seen poisoning cases before. The symptoms match exactly. With the exposure those children are getting daily for hours in an enclosed space, it's a wonder more haven't died. Margaret sank into a chair, her hand at her throat. Then Mr. Carver is knowingly. I can't prove he knows the extent of the danger. He may have been sold the process as safe, or he may be deliberately ignoring the risks because it's profitable. But the result is the same. Children are dying. Cross closed his notebook. I need to examine every child who's worked in that shed. Document their symptoms. Establish a clear pattern. Then we have evidence that can't be dismissed. How will you do that without revealing yourself? Can you arrange visits to their homes? Say I'm concerned about their educational progress. Want to check on those who've been absent from school? Margaret nodded slowly. Yes, that could work. The families trust me. If I vouch for you, she stood, moving to a cabinet where she kept records. I have a list of all the children who work in the processing shed. 12 of them are currently healthy enough to work. 5 are too sick and have stayed home. And then there are the 5 who've died. I need to speak with the families of the deceased as well. Learn everything I can about the progression of their illness. It'll be harder. They're frightened. Harlan. When a child dies and you're powerless to stop it. When you're completely dependent on the man who owns the land you live on, the store where you buy food, the shed where you work, you learn to stay quiet, to not ask questions that might anger those with power over you. Cross understood. He'd seen it during the war and after, the way power dynamics could silence people, make them complicit in their own oppression simply because speaking out meant risking everything. It made him angry, but it also made him more determined. We start with the sick children, then the ones currently ill. If I can help them, if their families see that I genuinely want to help, maybe they'll trust me enough to talk about the others. They spent the next hour planning. Margaret knew each family, their situations, their fears. She advised Cross on how to approach them, what to say, how to build trust. Then she led him to the first cabin. Ruth and Thomas lived in a small structure at the end of one row of cabins. The building was perhaps 12 feet square, with a single room that served as bedroom, kitchen and living space for Ruth, her 3 children and her elderly mother. The walls were rough wood with gaps that would let in winter wind. The floor was packed dirt. There was a small fireplace for cooking, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and 2 narrow beds with thin mattresses. Ruth answered Margaret's knock with a baby on her hip and weariness in her eyes. She was perhaps 30, thin and worn, with hands that showed the calluses of hard labor. "Miss Margaret," she said, her eyes moving to Cross with question. "Ruth, this is Mr. Cross, a teacher from Boston. Who's visiting us? He's concerned about the children who've been absent from school. May we come in to check on Thomas?" Ruth hesitated, then stepped back. "Thomas is sleeping, Miss Margaret. He's been feeling poorly." Inside, the cabin was dim and close with heat. An elderly woman sat in one corner, fanning herself with a piece of folded paper. In one of the beds, a boy lay motionless. Cross approached slowly, keeping his movements non-threatening. "Hello, Thomas. My name is Mr. Cross. Miss Margaret tells me you haven't been feeling well. May I check on you?" The boy opened his eyes. They were dull, unfocused. He nodded slightly. Cross sat on the edge of the bed, pulling his medical bag closer. Under pretense of checking the boy's forehead for fever, he began a systematic examination. Pulse weak and thready, temperature slightly elevated but not high fever, skin. The pallor was striking with a greyish tint that was clearly abnormal. He gently took the boy's hand, examining the fingernails, brittle with bluish discoloration at the nail beds and fingertips. "How long have you been feeling sick, Thomas?" "Few weeks, sir." The boy's voice was weak. "Started with just being tired. Now my stomach hurts all the time." "Where exactly does it hurt?" Cross gently pressed on the abdomen, noting the rigidity, the way Thomas flinched. "Here, sir." Thomas pointed to his upper abdomen. Cross continued his examination, checking the boy's eyes. Pale conjunctiva, another sign of anemia. He looked at the gums, pale and slightly spongy. He tested reflexes. They were present but sluggish. Every finding confirmed his suspicions. "Ruth," he said quietly, "has Thomas vomited? Had any diarrhea?" She nodded, wringing her hands. "Yes, sir. Nearly every day now. Can't keep much food down. I've been giving him broth like Dr. Vaughan said, but it don't seem to help much. And he works in the processing shed." "Yes, sir. Been working there since last November. Mr. Carver, he pays good wages for that work. We need the money with 3 children and my mama to feed." Cross heard the defensiveness in her voice, the guilt. She knew something was wrong, but was trapped between needing the income and watching her son sicken. "I'm not judging you, Ruth," Cross said gently. "You're doing what you must to survive. But I need to know. Does Thomas come home with his hands stained from the work? Does his clothes smell of chemicals?" "Yes, sir. The stains don't wash out no matter how hard I scrub. And the smell." She paused. "It's harsh. Makes my nose burn when I wash his clothes. Does he ever mention feeling sick while working? Headaches, dizziness, nausea?" Ruth looked at Margaret, then back at Cross. "Sometimes he says the air in the shed makes him feel strange sometimes, but he keeps working because he's a good boy. Wants to help the family." Cross felt the weight of it. This child, barely 9 years old, working 6 hours a day in a toxic environment because his family needed 50 cents a day, knowing he felt sick, but pushing through because his mother, his grandmother, his siblings depended on that meager income. "Ruth, I need you to trust me. I'm not just a teacher. I'm a physician, and I think Thomas is very sick because of something in that shed. I think the chemicals they're using are poisoning him and the other children who work there." Ruth's eyes widened. She looked at Margaret, who nodded. "Confirmation. Can you help him?" Ruth asked, her voice breaking. "Can you make him better?" "I can try, but the most important thing is that he stops working in that shed immediately. No more exposure to those chemicals. But Mr. Carver, he'll be angry if Thomas just stops showing up. He might dismiss us, turn us out. I'll handle Mr. Carver," Cross said with more confidence than he felt. "Right now, Thomas's life is more important than anything else. Will you keep him home?" Ruth looked at her son, then slowly nodded. "Yes, sir, I'll keep him home." Cross left some basic medicines, bismuth for the stomach upset, iron tonic for the anemia, instructions for forcing fluids. He knew these were only palliatives, that the real treatment was removing the source of poisoning. But it was something. They visited 4 more families that afternoon. The pattern was identical each time. Children who worked in the processing shed, now sick with the same constellation of symptoms: weakness, abdominal pain, vomiting, the characteristic grey pallor, and bluish extremities. Families desperate for help but terrified of losing their livelihoods. Trust that to be built slowly, carefully before they'd speak openly. By the time the sun began to set, Cross had examined 8 children in various stages of arsenic poisoning. He documented everything carefully, taking notes that would serve as evidence, but he'd also seen the human cost, the fear in mothers' eyes, the exhaustion of children who should have been playing but instead lay listlessly in their beds, the grinding poverty that made every decision a calculation of survival. He and Margaret walked back toward the main house in silence, both too overwhelmed to speak immediately. Finally, Margaret said, "What do we do now? You have your evidence. What's the next step?" Cross stopped walking and looked back toward the processing shed, its chimney silhouetted against the darkening sky. "I need to get inside that shed again at night when no one's there. I need samples of that chemical solution, documentation of exactly what's being used. The examinations prove the children are sick, but I need to prove definitively what's causing it. That's incredibly dangerous. If you're caught, I know, but without that proof, Carver can keep claiming it's just unfortunate coincidence. With it, we can force the authorities to act." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Then I can get you a key. Sarah, the housekeeper, she's troubled by what's happening. She's kept her own records, seen the pattern. I think she'll help us. Then we do it Sunday when the shed is empty and Carver is at church in town." "Sunday." Margaret agreed. "God help us." The next 2 days were a delicate dance of deception. Cross continued his role as visiting educator, sitting in on Margaret's classes, meeting with more families, always observed by Carver's watchful eyes. But at night, in his room at the boarding house, he compiled his medical notes into a comprehensive report documenting the pattern of illness among the children who worked in the processing shed. On Saturday evening, Margaret brought someone to meet him at the boarding house, an older black woman with silver hair and intelligent, sad eyes. This was Sarah, the plantation's housekeeper, who had served the Carver family for over 30 years, first as a slave, now as an employee. They met in Cross's small room, speaking in low voices. Sarah sat on the single chair while Cross and Margaret stood. "Miss Margaret says you're trying to help the children," Sarah began without preamble. "Says you're a real doctor, that you think you know what's killing them." "I do," Cross replied, "and I need your help to prove it." Sarah reached into the bag she carried and pulled out a small leather-bound book. "I've been keeping records since the new shed opened last November. Wrote down everything I saw, everything I heard." Cross took the journal reverently and began to read by lamplight. Sarah's handwriting was careful and clear, each entry dated and detailed. November 10th, 1869. The new tanks arrived today. Big metal things that took 4 men to carry into the shed. Mr. Carver was excited, said this would change everything. November 15th, the children started working in the shed, 12 of them. Mr. Carver showed them how to handle the seeds, dip them in the solution, lay them out to dry, said they had to be careful that the chemicals were valuable, but he didn't give them gloves or nothing to protect their hands. November 28th. Little Mary complained her hands hurt. They were stained black and she said they burned. Her mama washed them but the stains wouldn't come out. December 20th. Several children looking poorly. Mr. Carver says it's just winter weakness that they need more food, but they all work in that shed. January 15th, 1870. Mary is very sick now, can't hold down food. Dr. Vaughan came, said it's fever, but I don't think that's right, something's wrong. February 3rd, Mary died last night. Her mama is heartbroken. That's the second child gone since December. Both worked in the processing shed. February 12th. I asked Mr. Carver if maybe the chemicals could be making the children sick. He got angry, told me to mind my own business, that I don't understand modern agricultural methods. March 8th, more sick children. James is the worst now, same symptoms as Mary had. The vomiting, the grey skin, the fingertips turning blue. April 2nd, James died today. I can't keep silent anymore. But who would listen to me? Who would believe an old black woman over Mr. Silas Carver? The entries continued, page after page of careful observation documenting the gradual realization that something was terribly wrong. Sarah had noted not just the illnesses but also Carver's responses, his dismissal of concerns, his insistence that the work continue, his anger when questioned. "This is extraordinary documentation," Cross said quietly. "Sarah, you've been recording evidence that could save lives." "Could save lives or could get me dismissed," Sarah replied. "I'm too old to find other work easy, but I'm also too old to go to my grave knowing I stayed quiet while children died." She looked at him intently. "Miss Margaret says you plan to go into the shed tomorrow. Get proof of what's in those tanks. I'm giving you this journal. Use it however you need to. Just make it stop. I will," Cross promised. "But I want you to know when this comes to light, Carver will know someone gave us access, shared information. There could be consequences. I know. I'm ready for that." Sarah stood preparing to leave. "Just promise me one thing, Doctor. Don't let their deaths be for nothing. Don't let those children be forgotten." After Sarah left, Cross and Margaret sat together, the journal between them. Margaret spoke first. "This changes things. With your medical documentation and Sarah's records, we have a complete picture. Even if we can't get samples from the shed, this might be enough." "It might be," Cross agreed, "but I still want to get those samples. Physical evidence that can be analyzed that proves exactly what's in those tanks. It will be irrefutable." "Then we do it tomorrow as planned. Sarah left a key for me. It's a copy of the shed key made last year when they had the locks redone. Mr. Carver doesn't know she kept it." Cross nodded, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. Breaking into the shed was illegal, could result in arrest if they were caught. But children were dying, and sometimes the law moved too slowly to save lives. "Tomorrow, then. What time does the family leave for church?" 8. They'll be gone until at least 1 in the afternoon. Services are long, and then they usually have Sunday dinner in town. That gives us 5 hours, more than enough time. I'll ride out at 9, meet you near the shed." They finalized the details. Then Margaret left for the night. Cross spent the next several hours reading and rereading both his notes and Sarah's journal, preparing himself for what was to come. He fell asleep finally near midnight, the journal still in his hands, and dreamed of children with grey faces and blue fingers reaching out to him from darkness. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot, promising another sweltering day. Cross-dressed in old clothes, if they encountered chemicals, he didn't want to ruin his good garments. He packed his medical bag carefully with empty vials for collecting samples, notebooks for documentation, and a basic medical kit in case something went wrong. Mrs. Patterson looked at him oddly as he left the boarding house so early on a Sunday morning, but she said nothing. Cross had learned that she asked few questions, which was why Margaret had recommended this particular establishment. He rode slowly toward Carver Plantation, watching for the family's departure. From a distance, concealed in a grove of trees, he saw the elegant carriage pull away from the main house. Silas Carver, his 2 adult children, and what appeared to be an elderly aunt, all dressed in Sunday finery, heading to town for services at the Episcopal Church. Cross waited a full 30 minutes after they disappeared from view, making certain they weren't returning for something forgotten. Then he urged his horse forward, circling around to approach the shed from the direction of the workers' quarters where he'd be less visible from the main house. Margaret waited where they'd arranged, near a large oak tree that provided some shade. She looked pale but determined. "Any problems?" Cross asked quietly as he dismounted. "No, Sarah's in the main house. She stayed behind claiming illness, so she's the only one there. She'll watch and warn us if anyone unexpected comes. The workers are all in their quarters or at their own church services. We should be undisturbed." They approached the shed quickly. The area was eerily quiet, no sounds of work, no voices, just the buzz of insects and the distant call of birds. The shed seemed larger and more ominous in the stillness. Margaret produced the key with shaking hands. It took her 2 tries to get it into the lock, fear making her clumsy. Then the lock turned with a heavy click and the door swung open. The smell rolled out to meet them, that harsh, chemical odor even stronger than Cross remembered. Without the noise and activity of workers, the shed felt like a tomb, dark and close and heavy with threat. Cross lit the lantern he'd brought, casting dancing shadows across the interior. "Stay near the door," he told Margaret. "Keep watch, and if you see anyone coming, call out immediately. I need you to be my eyes while I work." Margaret nodded, positioning herself where she could see both into the shed and out across the grounds. Cross moved deeper into the building, his lantern held high. In the daylight silence, he could examine everything more carefully. The works were covered with a fine powder, grey-green in color. He ran his finger through it and examined the residue, definitely metallic, with the characteristic texture of an arsenic compound. He took out a clean handkerchief and carefully collected a sample. Here is a rewritten, polished English version with a natural YouTube-style call to action added at the end, keeping the same meaning and dark tone. He folded the material carefully and tucked it into a glass vial before moving toward the drying racks. Rows of treated seeds lay spread out, each one coated in the same dull grey-green substance. He collected another sample. Then he approached the tanks, the true heart of the operation and the place where the greatest danger lurked. There were 3 of them, each nearly 4 feet tall and 3 feet in diameter, constructed from what appeared to be cast iron. The metal was badly corroded in several places, eaten away by whatever chemicals had been stored inside. Cross set his lantern down with care and lifted the lid of the first tank. The stench was overwhelming. At this range, acrid, metallic, so strong it made his eyes burn. He forced himself to breathe shallowly through his mouth, refusing to inhale too deeply. The liquid inside was nearly black, thick with what looked like a heavy concentration of dissolved material. An oily sheen floated across its surface. Taking out a glass vial, Cross slowly dipped it into the tank, collecting a sample. Despite his pounding heart, his hands remained steady. As he sealed the vial, something caught his attention. A barrel positioned near the tanks. If you enjoy dark, mysterious historical stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and click the like button to support the content.